An emotional and touching story of loss, secrets, and the fragile journey toward redemption. In the heart of London, two strangers, bound by grief, find solace in each other's presence. Oliver, a man haunted by the shadows of his past, and Emily, a woman searching for answers after an unbearable tragedy, are drawn together in a bond neither expected. As their connection deepens, the weight of unspoken truths threatens to tear them apart. In a world where forgiveness feels impossible and pain lingers like a ghost, can love truly heal the wounds of the past? Witness a tale of resilience, vulnerability, and the powerful choice to move forward, even when the path is uncertain. Before we start the story, write in the comments where you're watching from. Oliver Hartman had always hated hospitals. Not for their sterile aesthetics or the faint smell of disinfectant, but for the silence. It was the kind of silence that seemed to scream, amplifying every thought he tried to suppress. The support group meeting room at St. James Hospital carried that same atmosphere. Perhaps even worse. The people around him seemed swallowed by the void, and he wasn't far from that fate himself. Sitting on an uncomfortable plastic chair, Oliver scanned the room. Blank faces, red-rimmed eyes, whispers barely forming complete words. He didn't want to be there, but his sister had been adamant. "You need to talk to someone," she'd insisted. Talk. As if words could mend what was broken. That's when she spoke. Emily Clark. Her voice was low, hesitant, but something about it made him lift his head. Maybe it was the fact that she wasn't trying to scrape the edges of her pain like the others seemed to be. Instead, Emily held hers tightly, as if it were part of her. "I lost my husband a year ago," she began, and Oliver noticed the slight tremble in her hands. He was everything. It was a car accident. A driver fled. They never found who it was. Oliver held his breath. The weight of her words expanded in the room like an endless echo. He lowered his gaze to the floor, avoiding everyone's eyes, especially hers. "It's strange," Emily continued, a bitter smile briefly flashing on her face. "People talk about time healing, about learning to let go. But what they don't tell you is that, sometimes, the pain is the only thing left." The silence that followed was deafening. Oliver clasped his hands in his lap, trying to keep his composure. When it was his turn to speak, he couldn't. Words felt like an insult to Victoria's memory. So he simply shook his head, declining the opportunity to share. After the meeting, Oliver almost bolted for the door, but something stopped him. Emily was in the hallway, fiddling with the strap of her bag. She didn't look desperate or lost like most of the others. She looked contained, resilient, in a way. "First time at the group?" she asked, not looking directly at him. "Yes," he replied curtly. Then, trying to soften the edge in his voice, he added, "Have you been coming for long?" 6 months. "It's different. It doesn't always help. But sometimes," she shrugged. He wanted to ask if it was really useful, but he stopped himself. The conversation felt like a thread he didn't know how to hold without snapping it. "Emily," she said suddenly, extending her hand. "Oliver." He shook her hand, noticing how her fingers were thin but firm. For a moment, they stood in silence. People passed through the hallway, but Oliver only heard the heavy thrum in his ears. Finally, Emily smiled, small and almost invisible. "Good luck, Oliver," she said before walking away. He stood there for a long time, watching her disappear through the door. There was something about her that intrigued him, something beyond the pain. And that scared him. That night, back at his empty house, he opened the drawer of his desk. Inside was an envelope marked with a police seal. His name was scrawled in one corner, alongside the title, "Accident Report, Case 1847. He didn't need to open it to know what was inside. He didn't need to relive the details of the day his wife died in the same accident that took Daniel Clark's life. And he certainly didn't need a reminder that he had been the one behind the wheel. With trembling hands, Oliver closed the drawer. He knew he couldn't keep the secret forever. But, for now, he would bury it, along with everything else. Outside, the city continued its indifference, as always. But for the first time in months, Oliver wondered if pain could be more than just a burden. Maybe, he thought as he lay in that cold bed, maybe it could be a bridge. And perhaps Emily was on the other side. Oliver woke to the pale rays of London's sun filtering through the thick curtains of his mansion. The air in the house felt as heavy as his mind. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face as if trying to erase the exhaustion that seemed to come from his soul rather than his body. The desk drawer was still locked. The secret remained, but he knew it wouldn't for long. On his way to the support group, his thoughts returned to Emily. Something about her had stirred something inside him, a feeling he couldn't quite define. Curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper that he wasn't ready to confront. He wasn't entirely sure why he was going back. Maybe it was because of her. When he arrived, Emily was already there, seated in the same chair as the last meeting, her shoulders slightly hunched as she fidgeted with the ring on her finger. Oliver noticed the gesture and wondered if that ring was the only tangible connection she still had to Daniel. He hesitated before sitting beside her. He didn't want to seem intrusive but couldn't bring himself to ignore her either. She turned her head, surprised, and offered him a brief smile. "You came back," she said, her tone tinged with surprise. "Yes," he replied, trying to sound casual. "I suppose it's worth trying again." She studied him for a moment, as if evaluating his sincerity. Before she could respond, the group moderator began the meeting. This time, Oliver spoke. Not much, just enough for Emily to know that he, too, was carrying a heavy burden. He mentioned Victoria but kept the details vague, saying only that she had died in an accident. When he finished, he felt her gaze on him, intense but not intrusive. After the meeting, they found themselves in the hallway again. "Want to grab a coffee?" Emily asked suddenly, breaking the silence between them. Oliver blinked, surprised, but nodded. "Sure. Why not?" They went to a small cafe near the hospital, a quiet place with worn wooden tables and a faint aroma of cinnamon. They sat in a corner, away from the other patrons. "You don't seem like the type who enjoys groups," Emily said, stirring sugar into her cup. "And you seem like the type who enjoys analyzing them," Oliver countered with a faint smile. She laughed, but there was something serious beneath it. "Not exactly. It's just rare to see someone like you there. Usually, it's people like me. Like you. Ordinary. Invisible. You don't strike me as someone who goes unnoticed." Oliver considered how to respond. She wasn't entirely wrong. His life before the accident had been anything but ordinary. But he didn't want to talk about that. Not with her. "I think grief makes us all the same," he said finally. "Rich, poor, ordinary, or not. In the end, we're all just trying to survive the pain." She was silent for a moment, stirring her coffee. "Do you really believe that? That we can survive it?" Oliver hesitated. The honest answer was no. He didn't yet believe life could become more than a long succession of empty days. But he didn't want to be cruel. "I don't know," he said. "But I want to believe it." Emily studied him closely. There was something about Oliver that intrigued her, but also made her cautious. He was kind but guarded, and that guardedness seemed to have layers. She wasn't sure if she wanted to unravel them or leave them untouched. The coffee lasted longer than either of them expected. When they said goodbye, the conversation still felt unfinished, as if there was more to be said, but neither dared to say it. Back at home, Oliver stared at his phone for what felt like hours before pulling up a number from the group's contact sheet. He thought about calling, but doubt consumed him. Was he drawn to Emily because she was interesting, or because she was a living reminder of what he had destroyed? He didn't have an answer, but as he put the phone down, he knew, somehow, that this connection was beginning to feel inevitable. The relationship between Oliver and Emily was starting to take shape. There was something natural, though hesitant, about their frequent meetings after the support group. Sometimes it was a brief phone call in the middle of the day. Other times, an impromptu walk in the park. Emily didn't ask too much about Oliver's life before the accident, and he let her speak about Daniel without feeling pressured to share more than he deemed safe. But the past, as Oliver knew all too well, was a patient enemy. It was a casual dinner at Emily's house. She had prepared something simple, a recipe she'd learned during her marriage to Daniel. She mentioned offhandedly while setting the table. Oliver couldn't ignore the unease that crept in as he realized, once again, he was occupying a space that didn't belong to him. "It's nice to have company for dinner," Emily said as she poured the wine. "Since I lost Daniel, this house feels so big." Oliver nodded but stayed silent. There was no right response to that. He knew. Emily gestured toward a shelf by the fireplace. Daniel loved books. I think he had an obsession with collecting them, even the ones he never read. Oliver stood up, feeling the need to shift the focus. He walked over to the shelf and let his eyes skim over the spines. Classic English literature, a few Russian translations, even some science fiction titles that seemed out of place. And then he saw it. A photograph. It was Daniel. He was smiling, standing next to Emily on a sunny beach that seemed completely removed from the cold London they both knew. Oliver recognized the face immediately, even without the wreckage of the accident. The still body, the shattered glass, the piercing sound of the siren. The wine glass slipped from Oliver's hand and shattered on the floor. "Oh my God, are you okay?" Emily rushed over, her voice filled with concern. Oliver couldn't answer right away. His mind was spinning, and a wave of nausea rose in his chest. "Sorry," he said finally, kneeling to pick up the shards. "It was an accident. I was distracted." Emily frowned but didn't press him. "Leave it. I'll clean it up later." He stood, trying to compose himself, but the world seemed out of focus. Emily went to the kitchen to grab a cloth, leaving him alone with the photo. He stared at it, frozen. "You seem distant," Emily said when she returned, placing a light hand on his arm. "I'm fine," Oliver lied, forcing a smile. They finished dinner, but Oliver barely touched his food. The easy atmosphere had dissolved, replaced by a tension neither of them could ignore. He left early, using work as an excuse, and was out the door before Emily could question him further. Back at his mansion, Oliver opened the drawer. The accident report was still there, untouched. Daniel Clark's name glared back at him like a curse written in black ink. He already knew that Daniel was the man who had died in the crash that also claimed Victoria, but seeing his face alive, smiling beside Emily, made it unbearable. The phone rang, breaking his thoughts. It was Emily. He hesitated before answering. "Hi," she said, her voice calm but tinged with worry. "Are you okay? You seemed off during dinner." Oliver scrambled for a convincing excuse. "It's just been a tough day at work," he said, which wasn't entirely untrue. "I'm sorry if I seemed distant." "You don't have to apologize," Emily said. "I just thought you seemed different." The silence that followed was heavy, as if both of them knew there was something unspoken between them. But neither dared to break the fragile bubble. "I've been thinking," Emily continued, her voice quieter, "about the accident. You know, it's strange how all I have are fragments. Daniel was on his way to a meeting that morning. I didn't even know exactly where. The police said it was quick, but sometimes I wonder if there's something I could know, something that would help." Oliver gripped the phone tightly. Every word she spoke felt like a blow. "Sometimes, we don't need all the answers," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Sometimes, they don't help." Emily was silent for a moment, and when she replied, her voice sounded distant. "Maybe you're right." After they hung up, Oliver sat in the dark. He knew the fragile peace between them was about to shatter. And worse, he knew he was the one holding the hammer. The past, as always, was knocking. And this time, he couldn't ignore it. Oliver couldn't avoid Emily. He didn't even want to. She made him feel something he hadn't accessed in a long time: humanity. But every conversation, every meeting, every shared moment only deepened the fracture between who he wanted to be for her and who he really was. They were walking through Regent's Park that afternoon. London's grey sky threatened rain, but Emily seemed indifferent to the weather. "You seem better," she said, her eyes fixed on a nearby pond where ducks glided with absurd tranquility. "Better," Oliver repeated, as though the word was foreign to him. "Yes. More present. I guess the group helps after all." He wanted to tell her that the group had nothing to do with it. That the only reason he seemed better was because she was there. But the truth weighed on his tongue, making any words impossible. "Emily," he began, hesitation thick in his voice. She turned to him, tilting her head slightly, curious. I need to tell you something. Before he could continue, she interrupted, laughing lightly. Wait. Before you do, I need to show you something. It's important. Oliver froze, his confession dying in his throat. She pulled a folder from her bag, something thin and worn. My friend Lucy works at a law firm, Emily said, not noticing the discomfort that quickly overtook Oliver. She helped me get more information about the accident. It's not much, but... She opened the folder and took out a few yellowed pages. Among them was a copy of the police report. Oliver recognized the document immediately. It was the same one he kept locked in his desk drawer. Look at this, Emily continued, pointing to an underlined section. The description of the car. A luxury model, a black Aston Martin. That's not exactly common, is it? Lucy thinks this might be an important clue. Maybe with more investigation. She stopped when she noticed Oliver's expression. He looked like all the blood had drained from his face. Oliver, are you okay? He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The moment he had dreaded had arrived. There was no way to escape now. Emily, he began, his voice hoarse. I know what happened that day. I know what you're trying to find out. She frowned, confused. What do you mean? He took a deep breath, as though he needed every ounce of oxygen to sustain the weight of what he was about to say. I was there, Emily. At the accident. I was the driver of the Aston Martin. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily stared at him as though he'd just said something impossible, something her mind refused to process. You, what? The word escaped her lips in a whisper, almost inaudible. It was an accident, Oliver said, desperately trying to find the right words and failing miserably. I didn't see Daniel in time. I lost control, and... You killed my husband. The question came out in a tone that was both incredulous and devastating. I lost someone that day too, he said, his voice breaking. My wife, Victoria, was in the car with me. I never meant... Stop! Emily shouted, stepping back. Her face was a mix of shock, pain, and something Oliver didn't want to name, disgust. You knew this from the beginning, she asked, her voice trembling. All this time, you knew. Yes, he admitted finally. I knew. But I didn't. I didn't know how to tell you. She stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Then, without another word, she turned and started walking away quickly. Emily, please. Oliver called after her, but she didn't stop. He didn't follow her. He knew he couldn't. Not after what had just happened. Back at his house, Oliver sank onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. He knew there was no fixing what he had done. And for the first time since the accident, he didn't try to justify his actions to himself. That night, he sat in the darkness, knowing that the abyss between him and Emily might be too wide to cross. And that, in the end, he only had himself to blame. The days that followed were silent. Not the kind of comfortable silence Oliver had learned to accept, but a crushing void filled only with guilt. Emily didn't answer his calls or respond to his messages, and he respected her need for space, even though it tore him apart. He knew he couldn't ask for forgiveness, not truly. There were no words that could undo what had happened. But still, he had to try. Oliver began visiting the cemetery where Daniel was buried. He went early, before anyone else arrived, and stayed for hours, sitting beside the grave marked with the name of a man he'd never known but whose life he had destroyed. Sometimes he spoke softly, as if confessing to Daniel. Other times, he just sat in silence. It was during one of these visits that Emily saw him. She was on the other side of the cemetery, holding a small bouquet of flowers. Their eyes met, and for a moment Oliver thought she might turn and walk away. But instead, she approached, slowly, as if every step was an effort. Why are you here? She asked, her tone sharp and unyielding. Oliver stood, but he didn't try to move closer. He knew any misstep could push her away forever. I wanted to apologize, he said, his words feeling small against the enormity of what he wanted to express. If that means anything. Emily stared at him for a long moment, her eyes a mix of pain and anger. Do you think coming here makes a difference? That this fixes anything? No, Oliver said honestly. I know it doesn't. But I needed to be here. I needed to try to understand what I took from you. She gripped the flowers in her hands, her gaze drifting to Daniel's grave. You have no idea what you took from me, she said, her voice trembling. Oliver remained silent. There was no arguing with that. She was right. I trusted you, she continued, her words coming out with difficulty. I thought I'd finally found someone who understood, someone who knew what it was like to lose everything. I do understand, Oliver said softly. She laughed bitterly. You understand? You killed the love of my life and kept it from me. How could you possibly understand? I understand because I lost everything that day too, he said, his voice breaking. I lost my wife. I lost any sense of who I was. And I lost the chance to make things right with you before it all fell apart. Emily stared at him, her eyes brimming with tears that she refused to let fall. You think this is about fixing things, Oliver? There's no fixing this. There's no bringing Daniel back. I know, he said. But I'm not here to fix anything. I'm here because I need to own what I did. You need to know that, even if you never forgive me, I'll never stop trying to be better. For you. For Daniel. For myself. For a moment, Emily seemed to falter. The anger was still there, but beneath it was something deeper, something more complicated. I need time, she said finally, her words slow and deliberate. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you. But, for now, I just need space. Oliver nodded, accepting her decision without protest. If you ever need me, he said carefully, I'll be here. Emily didn't respond. She simply placed the flowers on Daniel's grave and walked away, leaving Oliver alone once again. But this time, the silence felt different. It was still heavy, still difficult, but there was a faint spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. And fragile as it was, he held on to it. Emily kept her distance in the weeks that followed, but not entirely. She would occasionally respond to Oliver's messages, her tone reserved. She spent her days navigating a fragile emotional landscape, struggling to understand the chaos within her. Some mornings, she woke with a fierce anger, remembering all that Oliver had taken from her. Other days were quieter, when she found herself thinking about his voice, his presence, the way he seemed to carry her pain alongside his own. Despite everything, she knew she had to face what she felt. She needed to understand why, even now, she couldn't completely push him out of her life. On a rainy London afternoon, she gave in. Picking up her phone, she typed a simple message. I need to see you. Oliver replied almost immediately. Whenever and wherever you want. They met at the same cafe where it had all begun. The space felt smaller now, more confining, though perhaps it was just the weight of what was left unsaid. Thanks for coming, Emily said, stirring a spoon in her tea without looking directly at him. You don't need to thank me, Oliver replied, his tone cautious, as though he was stepping onto thin ice. A long silence stretched between them before Emily finally looked up. I read the letter you sent me, she said. I've read it several times, actually. Oliver didn't respond right away. That letter had been his most vulnerable attempt to explain his guilt, his pain, and above all, his love for her. And, he asked carefully. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wanted to tear it up. But another part, she trailed off, frustration evident in her voice. I feel divided, angry, sad, and something else I can't even name. Oliver nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. I don't expect you to forgive me, Emily. Not after what I did. But I need you to know that, no matter how this ends, you deserve peace. And if that means removing me from your life forever, I'll accept that. Emily stared at him, surprised. For the first time, he wasn't clinging to some desperate attempt to fix things. He was simply being honest. You think it's that simple? She asked, her tone challenging. No, he said. None of this is simple. But what happened that day was a terrible mistake. I regret every moment, every choice that led to it. But you have the right to decide how to live with it. The conversation softened after that. There were no easy solutions, but a new clarity emerged, a mutual understanding that they were both trying to make sense of the chaos. Days later, Emily made a significant decision. She sent Oliver a message. "Meet me tomorrow at the site of the accident." When Oliver arrived, she was already there, standing at the edge of the road where everything had happened. His heart tightened as he saw her distant expression, fixed on the rain-slick asphalt. "Why did you ask me to come here?" he asked quietly. "I needed to see it," she said. "I needed to remember. Not just what I lost, but what was left behind." Oliver stood silently, respecting her need for the moment. "Did you bring me here to tell me something?" he asked after a few minutes. She turned to him, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. "I brought you here because, as much as I hate to admit it, part of me wants to understand. Part of me wants to forgive. But I don't know if I'm strong enough for that." "You are," Oliver said firmly. "You're stronger than you think." Emily took a deep breath, trying to absorb his words. Then, without warning, she stepped closer and embraced him. It wasn't a gesture of complete forgiveness, but something simpler, an acknowledgement that he was part of her pain, just as she was part of his. When they finally pulled apart, she looked at him with a mix of vulnerability and determination. "This doesn't mean it's over," she said. "But maybe it's a beginning." Oliver nodded, grateful for the small victory. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt there was a chance to rebuild something, not perfect, but real. Oliver and Emily spent weeks navigating a sort of neutral ground. They weren't together, but they weren't completely apart either. It was a careful dance, full of silences that spoke louder than words. Despite the caution, there was something new in the air, an openness that hadn't existed before. Emily was still wrestling with her emotions. There were days when she woke up with a fierce anger, remembering what Oliver had taken from her. But there were other days, quieter ones, when she caught herself thinking about the sound of his voice, the way he looked at her, like he was trying to carry her pain along with his own. It was on one of those quieter days that she finally decided to accept one of Oliver's invitations. A simple outing to the museum. He'd told her he wasn't expecting anything grand, only that he wanted to share something that meant a lot to him, the modern art gallery at Tate Britain. When they arrived, the atmosphere was calm, almost empty, which made the meeting easier. Oliver seemed a little more relaxed, perhaps because he was in a place he loved, a place that didn't carry painful memories. "This one," he said, stopping in front of a painting that looked chaotic at first glance but, upon closer inspection, revealed nearly invisible patterns of shapes and colors. "Interesting," Emily said, tilting her head. "But also kind of confusing." Oliver laughed softly. "That's exactly why I like it. Every time you look at it, you see something different. I think it's a good metaphor for life, don't you?" Emily looked at him, surprised. "I didn't think you were the philosophical type." "It's not philosophy," he replied. "It's survival. Sometimes, all you can do is try to find beauty in the chaos." Emily stayed quiet, reflecting on his words. She was still learning how to find something beyond the pain, but in that moment, beside Oliver, it seemed possible. Later, they sat at the museum cafe. The conversation flowed more easily now, punctuated by pauses that no longer felt uncomfortable. Emily was beginning to see Oliver not just as the man who had caused her pain, but as someone who bore deep scars of his own. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began, stirring her tea, which had gone cold. "About what?" "About never forgetting. About carrying this with us, but in a way that doesn't destroy us." She paused, looking at him. "I think I'm starting to understand what you meant." Oliver studied her, unsure how to respond. He was afraid of saying the wrong thing, of breaking the fragile moment between them. "I don't know what this means for us," Emily continued. "But I know I want to try to understand." There was a slight tension in the air, but it wasn't unpleasant. It was the kind of tension that came with possibility. When Oliver dropped her off at home that night, there was a faint smile on Emily's face, something he hadn't seen in a long time. "Thank you," she said as she stepped out of the car. "For tonight." "For not giving up," she replied. Oliver was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I'd never give up on you." She didn't answer, but he saw the faint glimmer in her eyes before she closed the door. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she felt something she hadn't in a long time, a fragile, tentative lightness. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. Maybe it was the start of her own healing. Spring arrived quietly in London, as it always did. The chill gave way to a gentle warmth, and the trees in the city's parks began to bloom. Emily sat on a bench in Hyde Park, watching the world move around her. Families rushed past, couples strolled hand in hand, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air. It was a simple scene, but to her, it felt extraordinary. She glanced to her side and saw Oliver approaching. He carried 2 cups of coffee, his steps cautious as always, but his face carried an expression she was starting to recognize, a mix of patience and hope. "For you," he said, handing her one of the cups. "Thanks." Emily accepted the coffee and took a sip, letting its warmth spread through her hands. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them no longer carried the weight of tension or unspoken words. Instead, it felt comfortable, a shared space where they could just be. "Do you remember what you said?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. Her gaze lingered on a nearby lake where the water rippled gently. "What did I say?" "About grief never going away but learning to carry it." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think I was trying to fight it all this time, like there was some finish line, a point where everything would just feel okay again. But now," she trailed off, exhaling softly, "now I think I'm learning that it's more about moving forward with the weight. Not because the pain disappears, but because we find things that make life worth continuing." Oliver listened intently, his own thoughts echoing in hers. "I know I can't undo what I've done, Emily. I know it will never be perfect between us. But I'm willing to try. To try every single day, even if it means starting over again each morning." Emily turned to look at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know that. And maybe that's what gives me strength. You don't give up. Even when you have every reason to." "I'd never give up on you," Oliver said simply. She stayed silent, absorbing his words. Then, almost unconsciously, she reached out and touched his hand. It was a small gesture, but it held a profound meaning. "I forgive you," Emily said, her voice steady but soft. "Not because it's easy, but because I need to. For myself. For us." Oliver inhaled deeply, the weight of her words filling him with both relief and gratitude. He held her hand gently, as if he were holding something fragile and precious. "Thank you," he whispered. They sat like that for a while, side by side, their hands entwined, as the world continued to move around them. Emily knew the road ahead would still be complicated. This wasn't a perfect ending, and it never could be. Life wasn't made of perfection but of imperfections that, when embraced, created something truer, something more human. As she looked at Oliver, she felt an unexpected sense of peace. He was part of her pain, yes, but he was also part of her healing. Together, they would carry their burdens, their scars, and, most importantly, their shared choice to move forward. They stood and began to walk through the park, side by side, unhurried and without grand declarations. Just together. Because, in the end, that was what mattered, moving forward, not as 2 people running from their pain, but as 2 who had learned to accept it, and still chose love.
What did you think of this story? Would you be able to forgive like Emily did? Give it a rating from 0 to 10, and don't forget to follow us. Thank you so much for watching.